On the morning of February 19, 1942, a man in a shop in Oakland, California put a sign in his window. It said, "I am an American." He was born in the United States. He had lived his entire life there. He paid taxes, spoke English, and had never visited Japan. 3 days after he put that sign up, the government ordered him to report to a processing center with only what he could carry. His shop was closed. His property was sold for a fraction of its value. He spent the next 3 years behind a fence with armed guards who had orders to shoot anyone who tried to leave. His sign stayed in the window while he was gone. That is not a story someone invented. That photograph exists. It is in the National Archives. The man's name was identified. He was one of 120,000. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States government forcibly removed 120,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry from their homes and placed them in 10 prison camps scattered across the most remote and barren landscapes in the country. 2/3 of them were American citizens. Many had never been to Japan. Some did not speak Japanese. Some had sons serving in the United States Army at the same moment their families were being imprisoned by it. Here is what no history class will ever tell you. The people who knew the most about Japanese Americans, the FBI, military intelligence, naval intelligence, all concluded before the order was signed that mass imprisonment was unnecessary, and the order was signed anyway. The attack on Pearl Harbor happened on December 7, 1941. Within hours, the FBI began arresting Japanese Americans it had already identified as potential security risks. By mid-March 1942, FBI agents had detained approximately 1,200 prominent Japanese Americans, community leaders, businessmen, journalists, Buddhist priests. Those arrests were targeted. They were based on specific intelligence. They were, by every measure available, the appropriate response to a genuine security concern. What happened next was not. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, and not a man known for restraint in matters of national security, reviewed the proposal for mass evacuation of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. He called it unnecessary. He wrote in February 1942 that the necessity for mass evacuation was based primarily upon public and political pressure. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringle of Naval Intelligence had spent years in Japan, spoke Japanese fluently, and had personally dismantled a Japanese spy ring operating out of the consulate in Los Angeles. He concluded that the entire Japanese problem had been magnified largely because of the physical characteristics of the people. In November 1941, a month before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had commissioned Curtis Munson to investigate Japanese Americans on the West Coast and in Hawaii. Munson's report, submitted directly to the president, certified a remarkable, even extraordinary degree of loyalty among this generally suspect ethnic group. Roosevelt had the report. He had read it. He signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942 anyway. The order itself was careful. It did not mention Japanese Americans by name. It authorized the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. The language was deliberately vague. In practice, it applied to one group exclusively: Americans of German and Italian descent, whose countries were also at war with the United States, faced individual hearings, targeted arrests, and localized restrictions. Approximately 11,500 people of German ancestry and 3,000 of Italian ancestry were detained, most after individual review. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were removed en masse. No individual hearings, no review of loyalty, no distinction between citizen and non-citizen, between the young and the elderly, between the farmer who had never left California and the man who had fought for the United States in the First World War. General John DeWitt, who commanded the Western Defense and oversaw the removal, explained his reasoning in his final report. He wrote that because of their race, it was impossible to determine the loyalty of Japanese Americans. That sentence, "because of their race," was considered so inflammatory that a subordinate officer named Bendetson ordered all copies of the original report destroyed. In 1980, a copy was found in the National Archives. The notes showed the differences between the original version and the sanitized one that had been made public. The destroyed copies were the ones that told the truth about why it happened. Families were given 48 hours notice. On 48 hours notice, you cannot sell a house. You cannot sell a farm. You cannot liquidate a business built over decades. You can take what you can carry and leave the rest for whoever wants it. Neighbors bought Japanese American property for fractions of its value. Businesses that had operated for generations closed overnight. Farms that Japanese American families had cultivated on land nobody else wanted. Land that had been dismissed as marginal and worthless before they made it productive, were sold or simply abandoned. The total property loss, calculated in 1983 dollars by a congressional commission, was estimated at $1.3 billion. Net income loss was estimated at $2.7 billion. The assembly centers were often worse than what came after. One center was established at Santa Anita Park, a racetrack in Southern California. Entire families were housed in horse stalls with dirt floors. The smell never left. The more permanent relocation centers were built in places specifically chosen for their remoteness and their hostility. Manzanar in the California desert, Tule Lake near the Oregon border, Hart Mountain in Wyoming, Minidoka in Idaho, Topaz in Utah. The barracks were uninsulated tar paper construction, heated by coal-burning stoves, with common latrines, little hot water, and armed guards posted at the perimeter with orders to shoot. Japanese Americans built schools inside the camps. They organized sports leagues. They planted gardens in the desert dirt. They did this under the watch of men with guns who would shoot them if they walked past the fence. Fred Korematsu was a 23-year-old welder from Oakland. He had been born in the United States. He refused to report to the assembly center. He was arrested on May 30th, 1942, tried in federal court, convicted of violating military orders, and sent to an assembly center. He appealed. The case reached the Supreme Court of the United States. On December 18, 1944, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction. It ruled that the detention was a military necessity, not based on race. In dissent, Justice Robert Jackson wrote that Korematsu had been convicted of an act not commonly thought a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he was born and where all his life he has lived. Justice Frank Murphy called the exclusion order the legalization of racism and compared it to the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy. The 6 justices in the majority upheld the conviction. 40 years later, a federal court vacated Korematsu's conviction after evidence emerged that the government had deliberately withheld and suppressed intelligence reports from the Supreme Court, including Ringle's naval intelligence report that directly contradicted the military necessity justification. The government had lied to the Supreme Court. The court had relied on those lies to uphold the imprisonment of 120,000 people. While Japanese Americans were imprisoned in camps in the desert, the United States Army was recruiting them. In 1943, Secretary of War Stimson convinced Roosevelt to allow Japanese American men to enlist from inside the camps. Thousands volunteered. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans whose families were imprisoned behind fences in the United States, became the most decorated unit of its size in the entire history of the American military. They fought in Italy, France, and Germany. They rescued the Lost Battalion of Texas when no other unit could reach it. They came home to find their families still in the camps. The camps were not formally closed until January 1945, when the Supreme Court issued a separate ruling that the government could not detain citizens whose loyalty had been established. By then, some families had been imprisoned for nearly 3 years. When they were released, many had nowhere to go. Their homes were gone, their farms were gone, their businesses were gone. 10 states had opposed accepting Japanese Americans in the first place. The communities they returned to were not always welcoming. In 1948, Congress passed the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act. It offered compensation for documented property losses. The process was designed to be difficult. Claimants had to prove their losses with receipts and documentation. Documentation most families had not been able to gather on 48 hours' notice. The payments that were eventually made covered a small fraction of actual losses. No apology was included. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. It formally acknowledged that the incarceration had been the result of racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It issued an official apology. It awarded $20,000 to each surviving internee. Approximately 80,000 people were still alive to receive it. The rest had died waiting. $20,000 for 3 years of imprisonment. $20,000 for the farm, the business, the house, the years. $20,000 for the conviction that the Supreme Court had upheld on the basis of evidence the government knew was false. The apology came 46 years after the order was signed. The man in Oakland who put the sign in his window, "I am an American," his photograph became one of the most reproduced images from this period of American history. What is less reproduced is the timeline. Before the order was signed, the FBI concluded the mass evacuation was unnecessary. Naval intelligence concluded it was unnecessary. The president's own commissioned report concluded Japanese Americans demonstrated extraordinary loyalty. The Attorney General believed the order was not legal. The order was signed anyway. 120,000 people were removed. 2/3 were citizens. The report justifying the removal was so racist that copies were ordered destroyed. The suppressed version was found in the National Archives in 1980. The government withheld it from the Supreme Court while the court was deciding whether the imprisonment was constitutional. The court said it was. Every source cited in this video is publicly available. Executive Order 9066 is in the National Archives. The Munson Report is in the National Archives. The original DeWitt Final Report is in the National Archives. The Supreme Court decisions in Korematsu v. United States and Ex parte Endo are in the public record. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 is in the Congressional Record. The sign from Oakland is in a photograph at the Library of Congress. The man who put it in the window was named Tokichi Nishikubo. He was sent to a camp. He came back. He never put the sign up again.